Every act of human destruction begins the same way, with someone certain they are right. Jung discovered that the most dangerous people are not the obviously cruel or violent ones. They are the ones who truly believe they are good, the ones who see themselves as the savior, the victim, or the truth teller. Because when a person refuses to confront the darkness within, the psyche finds another way to release it, by projecting it outward. Suddenly their anger becomes your fault. Their insecurity becomes your betrayal. Their fear becomes your threat. And what was once an internal conflict turns into a quiet war that rewrites reality itself. Jung called this phenomenon shadow projection, but in practice, it's far more than theory. It's the moment when someone's unconscious darkness gains access to the external world, through you. The terrifying part is that they don't know they're doing it. Their conviction feels like clarity, but it's blindness. They are so certain of what they see that no evidence can reach them. And the more certain they become, the more dangerous the illusion grows. Entire families, friendships, and communities have been torn apart by one person's inability to face their own shadow. You've seen it. When someone accuses you of intentions you never had, emotions you never felt, words you never said. You try to explain, but every defense becomes proof against you. That's not miscommunication. That's projection taking control. This is what Jung warned about. When the unconscious takes over the conscious mind, it no longer creates lies. It creates realities. This video isn't about fear. It's about awareness. Because once you can see the signs of projection, you stop confusing someone's wound for your worth. You stop trying to heal what was never yours to carry. The first step to freedom is knowing when you've become someone else's mirror. Certainty can be the darkest shadow. It doesn't start with hatred. It starts with a misunderstanding, with someone subtly twisting your words, questioning your tone, or assigning meaning to things you never meant. At first, you try to fix it. You explain, you clarify, you apologize for the tension you didn't cause. But the more you try to correct it, the deeper you sink into their distortion. This is how shadow projection works. It recruits you into a story that isn't yours until you start doubting your own reflection. You begin to walk on eggshells around them, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of being misread again. You edit yourself just to keep the peace. And one day, you realize the peace was never real. It was a submission. Jung noticed this pattern in countless patients. People who lost their sense of self because they lived inside someone else's projection. The projector doesn't see you. They see the part of themselves they can't face. They call it your flaw, but it's their wound. They accuse you of manipulation, but it's their control. They call you distant, but it's their fear of intimacy. What makes this so painful is that the dynamic feels familiar. Many of us grew up with it. A parent who blamed you for their moods. A friend who always made you the villain in their story. A partner who loved you more for what you represented than who you were. Slowly, you learn to absorb their discomfort, to make yourself smaller, safer, easier to love. That habit didn't vanish. It followed you into adulthood, disguised as empathy. But there's a line between compassion and self-erasure. And once that line blurs, you lose the ability to know where you end and where someone else begins. Jung said, "What you do not make conscious will control you." And that's the essence of projection. It turns relationships into invisible battlefields where everyone is fighting their own unconscious war. The symptoms are subtle but unmistakable. Exhaustion after every conversation, guilt without clear reason, the creeping sense that your existence itself offends someone. That's not your fault. That's the shadow looking for a host. If this feels familiar, it's not because you're broken. It's because you've been the mirror too many times. This video will show you how to step out of that mirror without becoming cold. How to see projection as information, not identity. Because the moment you can recognize it, you stop carrying what was never yours. If these words feel like they're speaking directly to something you've lived, I invite you to stay. Subscribe, not as a formality, but as a small act of remembering yourself. Thank you for being here. You've reflected enough. It's time back. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries a private battlefield inside. The clash between who they appear to be and who they secretly are. He called it the confrontation with the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains everything the conscious mind rejects. Our anger, envy, pettiness, pride, cruelty, the fragments we bury to be loved. The problem is, what the mind represses doesn't disappear. It waits. It circles beneath awareness like an unspoken memory, and the more we deny it, the more it seeks expression. The psyche doesn't care about our social masks, it only cares about wholeness. So, when the shadow can't find a way out through honesty, it escapes through projection. It paints the outside world with the colors we refuse to see in ourselves. Suddenly, we don't feel jealous. We call someone else arrogant. We don't feel guilt. We call them manipulative. We don't feel insecure. We call them untrustworthy. The darker the content we avoid, the more distorted the image we project. Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." That sentence sounds gentle, but it's a warning disguised as wisdom. Because if you don't use irritation as a mirror, it will turn into a weapon. The more certain you are about someone else's flaws, the less you see your own. And that certainty, Jung warned, is the most dangerous psychological state. Certainty turns perception into prophecy. It blinds you from the possibility that the villain you've drawn might actually live inside you. Jung's patients taught him this through their suffering. Those who refused to acknowledge their own aggression always found it in others. Those who disowned their pride always found arrogance surrounding them. The unconscious has no moral sense. It only wants balance. If the ego can't face its darkness, it will create an external villain to maintain the illusion of purity. And when this happens collectively, when many people share the same projection, reality itself becomes infected. Groups begin to hunt for scapegoats. Families unite against one problem member. Communities collapse into shared delusion. It's not madness. It's unconscious collaboration. You've seen it online too. Outrage mobs, moral crusades. People convinced they're fighting evil when they've simply lost sight of their own reflection. The shadow doesn't need hatred to spread. It only needs conviction. That's why Jung said that awareness, simple, quiet awareness, is the beginning of all transformation. To see your irritation, your disgust, your judgment, and whisper to yourself, "This might also be me." That's where healing begins. And yet, few people ever reach that moment, because self-confrontation feels like death to the ego. The mind would rather rewrite the world than admit its own flaw. That's why the mirror turns black, because we're staring at ourselves without realizing it. If you've ever felt trapped in someone else's distortion, or wondered why good people sometimes become destroyers, stay with me. Because in the next part, we'll go deeper into the hidden mechanism behind projection, the unconscious loop that turns personal blindness into collective danger. Every shadow seeks its reflection somewhere. Jung said that the shadow doesn't only live inside individuals. It moves through systems, families, friendships, workplaces, entire societies. It's like a virus of perception. passing silently from one host to another. Once a projection leaves one's mind, it looks for others to confirm it. That's the loop. One person's blindness becomes another's borrowed certainty, and soon a collective delusion forms. Everyone agrees on something that was never real. Jung called this collective possession. He saw it in patients, in political movements, in small domestic dramas. A single unexamined wound spreads until it becomes an ecosystem of denial. It always begins quietly. A subtle accusation, a tone of moral superiority, a story told just slightly out of context. Then others hear it, repeat it, and feel virtuous for believing it. The shadow has escaped the individual and found shelter in the group. Once this happens, logic loses its meaning. Evidence no longer matters. The projector doesn't lie. Their perception simply stops updating. They no longer see what is. They see what confirms. Every contradiction becomes proof. Every defense becomes confession. You've seen it before. Someone convinced of your intentions, untouchable by truth, immune to nuance. It's not the reason they're defending. It's identity. Jung noticed that the psyche will do anything to protect its self-image, even if it means destroying reality itself. That's why projection feels so personal. It threatens the image we built to survive. To question it would unravel too much. So the unconscious does what it's always done. It hides the unbearable truth in plain sight. It places it in you, and in doing so, it preserves the illusion of innocence. That's how ordinary people become destructive without realizing it. They start small, misreading someone's words, assuming intention. But each misperception adds weight to the fiction. The moment they convince others to see through their eyes, a feedback loop begins. The collective shadow grows, and what started as emotional survival turns into psychological contagion. Jung warned that once the group begins to mirror a single person's projection, there's almost no way back. The entire structure becomes self-reinforcing. Families turn cold, teams fracture, friendships vanish overnight. Not because of evil, but because of unconscious alignment. This is how modern witch hunts are born. Not from cruelty, but from shared blindness. Every participant feels moral. Every voice feels justified. And yet, beneath the noise, the same mechanism keeps turning. The refusal to face the self. That's why awareness must come early. The longer you stay inside someone's projection field, the more it rewires your nervous system. You start to internalize their story. Your body tenses around their perception. You shrink before you speak. And one day, you wake up unsure of who you are outside their gaze. That's how the shadow wins. Not by power, but by confusion. Jung's solution was not confrontation, but withdrawal. Not silence as weakness, but silence as survival. When you stop feeding their conviction with explanation, their illusion loses oxygen. But if you fight to prove your truth inside their reality, you become another character in their dream. Sometimes the most courageous act is to leave the story unfinished. When you understand this loop, you start to see the pattern everywhere. In politics, religion, social media, even love. It's the same invisible architecture repeating itself. The fear of seeing one's own darkness, disguised as moral certainty. And if you can recognize it before it reaches you, you can step aside before the mirror closes. When the air thickens with certainty, don't argue. Step back. Let the illusion starve. Imagine walking into a gallery where every painting looks strangely familiar. Each face resembles yours. Each expression echoes something you once felt but forgot. At first, you think it's a coincidence. Then you realize, none of the portraits are of you, yet they all carry your eyes. This is the landscape of projection. The dark mirror is not made of glass. It's made of people. Each interaction reflects something you've denied, something unfinished. When you meet someone charming, confident, or cruel, your psyche starts tracing outlines, deciding who they are, who you are, in relation to them. But the mirror is tricky. It doesn't only reflect, it distorts, depending on how much truth you can tolerate. The less you want to see, the darker it becomes. Jung said the unconscious speaks in images, and projection is its language. When you can't admit anger, the world fills with aggressors. When you hide envy, success becomes unbearable to witness. When you suppress vulnerability, intimacy feels dangerous. The dark mirror shows you what you exile. And when you stare too long without awareness, your reflection begins to move on its own. You start reacting to ghosts instead of people, fighting battles that began in your childhood but now wear adult faces. Jung once described a patient who swore everyone around him was manipulative. He spent years destroying friendships, trying to escape the betrayal that existed only inside him. Every time someone got close, he'd see deception in their eyes, never realizing it was the echo of his own deceit, buried and denied. That's how the mirror works. It externalizes what you can't face, then convinces you it was there all along. The more you resist looking inward, the more control it gains, until one day, it no longer needs you. It begins reflecting through others, friends, lovers, strangers, each one mirroring a piece of what you've refused to own. You find yourself trapped in repetition, surrounded by familiar pain, wondering why the same story keeps finding you. But the mirror isn't punishing you. It's guiding you. It shows you what wants to be reclaimed. What you call betrayal might be a lesson in boundaries. What you call rejection might be your fear of being truly seen. Every reflection has a message hidden under distortion. The mirror doesn't lie. It just speaks in symbols. And the more you dare to decode it, the less power it holds. Jung said that the act of seeing the shadow is the beginning of transformation, because awareness dissolves possession. The mirror only stays dark when you refuse the light. If you've ever looked at someone and felt an emotion too sharp to explain, disgust, admiration, resentment, that's the mirror whispering. Pause. Ask what it wants to show you before it turns into a projection, because the moment you choose to look instead of blame, the reflection shifts. The darkness begins to fade, and what's left is you. When the mirror trembles, don't run, stand still and see what moves. You've probably been inside the dark mirror without realizing it. Maybe it happened in a friendship that slowly turned tense, in a relationship where every word became proof of guilt, or with a parent who never really saw you, only the reflection of their disappointment. It's subtle at first. You start adapting. You talk softer, you explain more, you shrink slightly every time their perception cuts through reality. You convince yourself it's empathy, but it isn't. It's survival. Your nervous system begins to associate safety with silence, acceptance with self-erasure. That's how the body learns to live inside someone else's projection. It forgets the difference between love and submission. Jung wrote that what we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate. And this is how it looks. You keep meeting the same kind of person, having the same argument, carrying the same invisible guilt. Different faces, same energy. The projection changes shape, but the pattern stays. Because the mirror is not outside anymore. It's in you now. You begin to anticipate others' needs before they're voiced, to sense moods before words are spoken. Hyper-awareness becomes your protection, but also your prison. You no longer experience people directly. You manage them, interpreting their tone through layers of past distortion. You call it intuition, but sometimes it's trauma dressed as foresight. The pain of projection is not just being misunderstood. It's slowly forgetting how to trust your own perception. You start asking yourself, am I really like they say? Did I do something wrong? Maybe I am too much. That's the real damage. The external distortion becomes internal noise, and soon your voice disappears beneath it. The danger of living as someone's mirror is that you stop existing as yourself, and yet something in you resists. A quiet awareness, small but steady, whispering, "This isn't the truth." That's the beginning of the return. Awareness doesn't arrive as fireworks. It arrives as stillness, a pause before defending, a moment of clarity in the fog. You begin to notice when someone's story about you doesn't match your inner feeling. You start recognizing that guilt can be inherited, not earned. That not every emotional burden handed to you must be carried. That's the moment Jung called psychological differentiation, when the self begins to separate from the projection field. It's not comfortable. It feels like betrayal, especially if you've been trained to equate peace with compliance. But differentiation is not cruelty. It's the restoration of perception. It's the decision to see clearly, even if it costs approval. When you stop being the mirror, people who relied on your reflection will resist. They'll call you cold, distant, changed. But what's really changing is your relationship with distortion. You're learning to live without permission again. The most painful part of awareness is losing the illusion of peace. The most freeing part is realizing it was never peace to begin with. When Jung spoke about freedom, he never described it as happiness. He described it as consciousness, the painful clarity of seeing without illusion. Most people don't want freedom. They want comfort disguised as peace. They want the mirror to stay polished, unbroken, even if it reflects lies. But real peace begins the moment you stop performing for someone else's perception. You stop fighting to be understood and start choosing to be aware. That's the quiet rebellion Jung called individuation. The process of becoming who you truly are, not who the world needs you to be. It begins when you learn to speak a new language, one that separates projection from truth. In that language, you stop saying, "They made me feel." You start saying, "Something in me responded." You stop saying, "They misunderstood me." You start saying, "I don't need to be translated." Awareness shifts the syntax of the soul. You move from defense to observation, from guilt to discernment. The mirror still exists, but now you see through it. You recognize how others reveal their inner worlds through the way they describe you. You begin to listen differently. Accusation becomes information. Criticism becomes a map of their unconscious. You no longer absorb it. You study it. Jung said, "Everything unconscious seeks outward expression. So instead of fighting shadows, you start tracing where they came from. You learn to name what doesn't belong to you and return it, quietly, internally, without drama. This is the birth of psychological sovereignty. But it's not easy. The moment you step out of the collective illusion, the world will try to pull you back. People addicted to projections need someone to hold their reflection. When you stop holding it, they panic. They'll say you've changed, that you've become distant, arrogant, detached. What they really mean is, you stopped playing the part. You stopped existing in their story. And for those still asleep, self-awareness looks like betrayal. This is the paradox Jung understood deeply, that awakening often feels like isolation before it becomes liberation. Because to stand outside the mirror means standing alone, at least for a while. But this solitude isn't emptiness. It's clarity. It's the silence after chaos, when your voice returns sounding softer, truer, more deliberate. You start speaking from inside, not in reaction to others' distortions. And people who meet you now sense something different. You're no longer easily moved, not cold, just centered. You listen, but you don't absorb. You feel, but you don't drown. You forgive, but you don't return. Jung wrote that the greatest act of love is to see another human being as they are, without projection. That includes yourself. Seeing yourself clearly is the most radical forgiveness there is. If you're feeling that quiet dissonance lately, the sense that certain connections no longer fit, it's not decay, it's alignment. Don't rush back into the mirror just because the silence feels heavy. Stay with it, because in that silence, something ancient is returning, your own authority. And if you stay with me till the end, you'll see why Jung believed this silence is not a loss, but the doorway to power itself, where freedom no longer depends on who understands you, but on how deeply you can understand yourself. When they call your stillness cold, remember, it's just the warmth of awareness they can't yet feel. Awareness without action becomes another kind of paralysis. Jung believed that consciousness must translate into movement. Small, deliberate acts that rewire the psyche. So how do you live outside the dark mirror? First, practice inner referencing. When someone projects onto you, pause before reacting. Ask yourself, does this feel true in my body? If it doesn't, don't rush to defend it. Let the silence hold the distortion until it dissolves. Second, practice energetic return. At the end of each day, imagine collecting your attention from every place it has been borrowed, from conversations, screens, people's opinions. Picture that energy returning home, settling in your chest. The more you reclaim your attention, the less the projections of others can enter you. Third, create what Jung called the small ritual of honesty. Once a day, name one uncomfortable emotion without justifying it. Envy, resentment, superiority, fear. Naming brings it into consciousness. What is conscious cannot control you. And finally, learn the art of not entering stories. When someone tries to make you their mirror, resist the impulse to prove your innocence. You are not responsible for the image they've created. Step aside gently, without judgment. Presence is more powerful than defense. Each time you do this, the mirror clears a little more. These aren't grand gestures. They're small realignments of awareness. But repeated daily, they begin to shift the architecture of your relationships. The dark mirror starts losing its hold. And what remains is a quiet confidence that doesn't need reflection to exist. Stand before your own image tonight. Breathe once, deeply. See what returns when everything false fades. When the reflection feels unfamiliar, stay. It might be the first honest one you've seen. The longer you live inside someone else's projection, the more you begin to lose the architecture of your own mind. Jung warned that the psyche cannot survive on borrowed perception. It eventually collapses under the weight of unreconciled truth. The cost of staying inside the dark mirror is not just emotional exhaustion, it's self-abandonment. You start to live reactively, measuring your worth by the distortions of others. Every time you adjust your tone to avoid conflict, you trade a piece of authenticity for temporary safety. Every time you apologize for someone else's discomfort, you reinforce the illusion that your existence must shrink for peace to exist. But peace built on distortion is just anesthesia. It numbs. It doesn't heal. Jung saw this pattern everywhere. People mistaking submission for compassion, silence for understanding, denial for strength. And he believed that awareness is the only cure strong enough to break the spell. Because once you see how projection works, you stop confusing love with control, guilt with responsibility, pain with meaning. You begin to recognize that being misunderstood isn't failure, it's protection. It means you've stepped outside someone's unconscious script. You are no longer an actor in their mythology. But this awareness comes with a price. When you stop participating in collective illusions, you lose belonging in the places that depend on blindness. People will distance themselves because your presence disrupts their comfort. Don't take it personally. You're not being rejected. You're being released. The self that survived inside the dark mirror can't walk with you now. You're shedding identities built on reflection, and that always looks like loneliness before it becomes liberation. The danger of unconscious living is that it keeps you surrounded but never seen. The reward of awareness is solitude that finally feels like truth. Jung said that every person must face the terror of self-knowledge, the realization that light and shadow are inseparable. To deny one is to distort the other. Real strength isn't purity, it's integration. The moment you accept that both the healer and the destroyer live within you, projection loses its power. You no longer need to paint your darkness on the world because you've made peace with its outline. So when someone tries to make you their villain, remember, they're only handing you the parts they can't hold. You can take them, look at them, and quietly give them back. That's not cruelty. It's clarity. Freedom, Jung said, is not about escaping the shadow. It's about walking with it consciously, without letting it decide who you become. And that's the final paradox. When you stop fearing the dark, the mirror stops reflecting it. It turns out clear. It turns into a window. Walk through it. Imagine walking through a corridor of fading echoes. Every step sounds softer than the last, as if the noise of the world is finally learning how to quiet itself. That's what happens when you stop defending your truth. You begin to hear it. Jung said the unconscious is like an ancient house. Every locked room holds a piece of your wholeness. Most people never open those doors. They stand in the hallway of familiar light, afraid of what might breathe behind the dark ones. But here's the secret. The fear you feel at the threshold is not a warning. It's an invitation. The doors don't guard monsters. They guard memory. They guard power. The parts of you that once hid in shame are waiting for you to knock, not to conquer them, but to listen. Because when you listen long enough, what once sounded like darkness begins to sound like depth. That's how freedom starts, not with a battle, but with a door quietly opening inside you. When you walk through that door, you realize something profound. There was never a war between light and shadow, only a misunderstanding. The light was never meant to destroy the dark. It was meant to hold it, to give it form. So tonight, don't search for peace by chasing silence. Let the silence come to you. Sit in it until you can hear your own pulse. That rhythm, that's you returning. And if something in you feels like it's still unfinished, that's not failure. That's where the next journey begins. Stay awake for it. Because sometimes, the door you fear most is the one that leads you home.